windows seemed to watch me, holding secrets too dark for the light of day. As I made my way back to the safety of the town, the adrenaline that had fueled my flight began to ebb, replaced by a shivering aftershock. What had I seen? Was it real, or just the product of the place's dark history and my imagination? These questions spun in my mind, unanswered. I knew one thing for sure: I would never return to that place. The haunted halls of the abandoned hospital were meant to be left alone, its stories buried in the rubble and decay. Yet even now, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the faint beeping of that heart monitor, a ghostly pulse in the darkness. Story 5. The catacombs of Paris, those endless underground ossuaries holding the remains of millions, had always intrigued me. I knew that beneath the vibrant city lay a shadow world, a dark mirror to the bustling streets above. So when the opportunity to explore it arose during my vacation, I couldn't resist. The idea of walking through history, surrounded by the bones of the past, was too compelling to pass up. Our tour group gathered on a gray, drizzly afternoon. As we descended the narrow stone steps into the catacombs, the air grew cooler and the clamor of the city faded to a hushed silence. Our guide, a man with a wealth of knowledge and a flair for dramatic storytelling, began to recount tales of the catacombs' creation and the many legends that haunted its corridors. The path was lit intermittently by dim lights, casting long shadows that danced on the walls. Between these lights, my flashlight guided me, its beam slicing through the darkness. Walls of bones and skulls, arranged with macabre care, lined the tunnels. It was both horrifying and mesmerizing, this tangible reminder of mortality. Intrigued by a particularly ornate arrangement of femurs and skulls, I lingered behind to take a closer look, my hand brushing against the cold, dry bones. The group's voices became distant echoes as I examined the patterns, lost in thought about the lives each of these remains had once held. Realizing I had strayed too far, I hurried to catch up, turning down a corridor I thought the group had passed through. But the tunnel only led to another, and then another, a seemingly endless labyrinth of bones. The damp air was thick, the only sound my own breathing and the crunch of gravel underfoot. I called out, but my voice was swallowed by the shadows, no reply coming but my own echoes. As I tried to retrace my steps, my flashlight flickered. Panic surged as the light dimmed, threatening to leave me blind in the subterranean darkness. I tapped it, pleaded with it, and for a moment it glowed bright before dimming again. In that brief surge of light, I saw a side passage I hadn't noticed before. With no better plan, I followed it, the narrow walls pressing close, as if they could collapse and entomb me at any moment. Skulls gazed hollowly from their perches, silent witnesses to my growing despair. The air grew colder, and I wrapped my arms around myself, the chills seeping into my bones. Then, I heard a faint shuffling sound behind me. I spun around, flashlight beam wild in the dark. Nothing. Just the endless rows of bones. My mind raced. Was it just my imagination, spurred by the stories and the oppressive atmosphere? Or was there someone or something else down here with me? The sound came again, closer this time, a soft scraping like fabric against stone. I wasn't alone. I moved faster, heart pounding, the rational part of my mind warring with primal fear. The flashlight flickered once more, then died completely, plunging me into darkness. Blind and terrified, I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, touching the cold, rough walls for guidance. The shuffling sounded again, now unmistakably the steps of someone or something following me. I broke into a run, my steps reckless and loud, echoes chasing me through the darkness. Time lost meaning as I ran, the weight of the earth above pressing down, the weight of history surrounding me. Finally, lungs burning and legs trembling, I collapsed against a wall, defeated, sobbing for help that I feared would never come. Then, light another flashlight beam, cutting through the darkness. Voices called my name, the tour guide leading the way. Relief washed over me in an overwhelming wave. They found me huddled in the dark, a small group of tourists with their concerned faces illuminated by their lights. The guide led me back to the main path, his steady presence calming my shattered nerves. As we walked, I glanced back at the dark tunnels we left behind, half expecting to see something there. But there was only darkness, silent and deep. Back in the light of the city, the fresh air felt like a balm. The group disbanded, and I was left alone with my racing thoughts. Had I really heard footsteps, or had the catacombs played tricks on my mind? The answer lay buried in the tunnels, hidden among the bones of history. I knew I would leave Paris with a story, a tale of getting lost in the catacombs. But more than that, I left with a renewed respect for the thin veil between past and present, and the eerie, enduring silence that watches over the dead. Story 6. The highway stretched out before me, a ribbon of asphalt slicing through the barren landscape. It was late, and the monotony of the drive was beginning to take its toll. That's when I saw him, a lone figure, thumb outstretched, by the side of the road. Picking up a hitchhiker wasn't something I normally did, but something about the desolate setting and his weary posture spurred a decision rooted in compassion rather than caution. He ran up to the car as I slowed down, a look of relief washing over his face. "Thank you," he said as he climbed in, dropping a small, battered backpack at his feet. "You're a lifesaver." His clothes were worn but clean, and he had an easy smile that seemed to put my initial reservations at ease. As we resumed the journey, the conversation started lightly, talk of the weather, the isolation of the road. But as the miles passed, his stories began to take a darker turn. He spoke of places he had been, always skirting the edges of legality. "I've been all over," he said, a distant look in his eyes, seen things that'd make your skin crawl. Curiosity piqued. I asked for more details. That's when the air in the car shifted, becoming thick with his words. "I've had to do things to survive," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Things that others might frown upon." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. His gaze turned sharp, probing. "Ever been truly desperate, my friend?" I kept my eyes on the road, feeling the weight of his stare. "Can't say that I have," I replied, my voice steady despite the growing unease. The conversation lulled, and I could feel his mood shift, a palpable change in the atmosphere. Then he continued, his voice a confessional whisper. "I've hurt people," he admitted, almost casually. "Not that I wanted to, you understand. But sometimes it's the only way." His hand rested on the backpack, and suddenly, every story took on a sinister hue, every glance a potential threat. Panic began to claw at my insides. I needed to get him out of my car, but the highway was still deserted, no sign of civilization in sight. Angering him seemed like a bad idea. I had no way of knowing what he was capable of, or what was in that backpack. Thinking quickly, I remembered a gas station a few miles ahead. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. "Need to refuel soon," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. "There's a station up ahead. You need anything?" He nodded, and I could feel the tension between us shift slightly. "Yeah, I could use a smoke," he said, his gaze shifting away from me, looking out the window. I breathed a silent sigh of relief. As we pulled into the gas station, the bright lights felt like a beacon of safety. "I'll just fill up," I said, pulling to a stop by the pump. "You go on ahead and stretch your legs, huh?" He grabbed his backpack and got out, and I watched him walk towards the convenience store. My heart was pounding as I filled the tank, my eyes darting around to make sure he wasn't coming back too soon. Once done, I hung up the nozzle and took a deep breath. This was it. I jumped into the driver's seat, turned the ignition, and as I pulled out of the gas station, I saw him exit the store, a cigarette already in hand. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I could see the confusion and then anger flare up as I drove away. The rest of the drive was a blur of adrenaline and relief. I didn't stop again until I reached the safety of a well-lit, crowded truck stop far from where I'd left him. Shaking, I realized how close I had come to a potentially dangerous situation, all from a simple act of kindness. As I sat there in the glow of neon signs, sipping a coffee that did little to calm my nerves, I resolved to be more cautious. The world, I reminded myself, was filled with unknowns, and not every stranded traveler was simply a soul in need of a lift. The hitchhiker's presence lingered in my car long after, a ghost of what could have been, a stark reminder that sometimes the danger we fear is closer than we think. Story 7. The night was dragging on, the restaurant finally quiet after the last customers trickled out and the clatter of dishes faded away. Working late had become my routine, the quiet hours allowing me to prep and clean without the chaos of the day shift. That night I was particularly focused, my mind on the tasks at hand and not on the potential hazards of a nearly empty restaurant. I headed to the cold storage to retrieve some ingredients for the next day. The walk-in was massive, lined with shelves stocked full of produce, dairy, and meats, a chilly vault that preserved the essentials of our kitchen. As I stepped inside, the door swung shut behind me with a soft but ominous thud. Engrossed in checking inventory, I barely registered the sound. It was only when I turned to leave, my arms laden with vegetables, that I realized something was wrong. The door handle wouldn't budge. I set down the produce and tried again, my efforts met with the same immovable resistance. Locked in. Panic fluttered in my chest as the cold began to seep into my bones. The storage was designed to be insulated, its walls thick and soundproof, keeping the internal temperature consistently near freezing. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but I knew the chances of being heard were slim. The kitchen was deserted, the remaining staff likely out front closing up, or too far to hear my muffled cries. The realization that I might not be found until morning sent a wave of dread through me. Hypothermia could set in if I didn't keep warm, but the biting cold was relentless, gnawing at my exposed hands and face. I rummaged through the shelves, looking for anything to use for insulation. Boxes of leafy greens and paper bags of mushrooms were hardly sufficient, but I wrapped them around my feet and hands, the paper crinkling and tearing in the frigid air. My breaths turned to visible puffs, and the cold stung my lungs. Time became a blur, each minute stretching into what felt like hours. I needed to stay active, to keep my blood circulating. I paced the length of the storage, rubbing my arms, doing jumping jacks, anything to keep the warmth in my body from seeping away. As I moved, a thought struck me. The cold storage, like any industrial fridge, must have some sort of emergency release mechanism. I stopped, turning slowly in place, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, in the dim light, I finally noticed it, a glow in the dark handle on the inside of the door, obscured by a hanging apron someone had carelessly left behind. I lunged for it, my fingers clumsy with cold. Pulling it did nothing at first, and panic surged again. But then, with a more forceful tug, I heard the click of the mechanism engaging and the door cracked open, a sliver of the warmer air outside seeping in. Relief washed over me as I pushed the door open and staggered out into the kitchen. The transition from the biting cold to the room temperature was jarring, and I collapsed onto the floor, shivering violently, but alive. My body shook not just from the cold, but also from the adrenaline that coursed through my veins. Lying there, waiting for my body to adjust, I realized how close I had come to a silent, frozen end. When the shivering finally subsided, I got to my feet, weak but grateful. I locked the storage properly, ensuring no one else would suffer a similar fate. The rest of the night, I spent warming up and reflecting on the incident. It was a stark reminder of the dangers that could lurk even in familiar environments, and of the thin line between routine and catastrophe. As dawn broke, I was there to greet the early morning staff, a smile fixed on my face, but a new caution settled in my heart. I shared my story, a warning to all about complacency and the importance of safety measures. The cold storage, with its newly marked emergency handle, stood as a chilling reminder of the night I nearly didn't survive. Story 8. The prospect of solitude had always appealed to me, so when the opportunity arose to become a lighthouse keeper on a remote island, I leapt at the chance. The island was a small, rugged patch of land, buffeted by the relentless sea and crowned with an ancient lighthouse that had stood guard over these waters for centuries. Arriving at my new home, I was struck by the profound isolation. The nearest mainland was a mere speck on the horizon, accessible only by a monthly supply boat. The lighthouse itself was a towering structure of weathered stone, its beacon a pulsing heart in the vast oceanic wilderness. Inside, the keeper's quarters were sparse but comfortable, a testament to the solitary lives of those who had tended this beacon before me. My days settled into a routine dictated by the rhythm of the sea and the duties of maintaining the lighthouse. I cleaned the lens, checked the fuel, and recorded the weather, my only companions the seabirds and the whisper of the wind. One night, several weeks into my tenure, a storm rolled in from the east, the kind that changed the color of the sky and churned the sea into frothing anger. I secured the windows and hunkered down, lanterns lit against the encroaching darkness. It was during one of my routine checks of the beacon that I first noticed it a carving on a tree just at the edge of the clearing surrounding the lighthouse. Curious, I ventured out into the storm, my lantern casting eerie shadows as I approached. The symbol was unlike anything I'd seen, circular, with intricate lines spiraling inward like a maze. I traced the grooves with my finger, wondering about its origin and purpose. The island had been uninhabited for decades, or so I had been told. Returning to the lighthouse, I felt an unease that I attributed to the storm. But as the night deepened, that unease grew into a palpable sense of dread. From the high vantage point of the lantern room, I scanned the darkness, the powerful beam cutting through the rain. That's when I saw a shadow moving at the tree line, just beyond the reach of the light. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my solitude-induced imagination. Yet the sight of the symbol, so deliberate and unfamiliar, suggested otherwise. I decided to investigate at dawn, the storm's intensity making any immediate exploration too dangerous. Morning revealed a landscape transformed by the storm, branches down, leaves scattered like confetti. I made my way to the spot where I had seen the shadow, my eyes scanning the ground for tracks or other signs. What I found chilled me to the bone were symbols, identical to the first, carved into several trees, forming a rough circle. Inside the circle, the ground was disturbed, the earth turned over as if someone, or something, had been digging. I stood there, the realization dawning that I was not alone on this island. The isolation I had once cherished now felt oppressive, a trap rather than a retreat. The following nights were fraught with tension. I kept the lighthouse beacon bright, sweeping the island's edges with its light, half expecting to catch sight of whatever shared the island with me. Fleeting shadows danced at the periphery of my vision, always vanishing when I tried to focus. Determined to understand what was happening, I started exploring the island by day, mapping the symbols, trying to discern any pattern or message. They seemed to lead somewhere, a trail that I followed deeper into the woods. That's when I stumbled upon a clearing, at the center of which stood an old stone altar, moss-covered and worn by time. The symbols were here too, more numerous, surrounding the altar like a language.